In the United States Navy of 1942, destroyers were officially hailed as the safest vessels afloat. Doctrine painted them as resilient warships, fast enough to evade danger, compact enough to avoid submarine attention, and nimble enough to dodge virtually any threat. Officers were briefed that serving aboard a destroyer carried less risk than flying from a carrier, manning submarines, or supporting amphibious assaults. Assignments to these ships were highly sought after, considered a mark of both honor and prudence. Yet the grim reality told a far more perilous tale. From December 7, 1941 through September 2, 1945, 71 destroyers and 11 destroyer escorts were lost in combat. These losses were not temporary withdrawals, nor minor damages. They vanished entirely. Out of roughly 340 destroyers engaged in active Pacific operations, 1 in every 5 never returned. During the Solomon Islands campaign alone, more sailors perished aboard destroyers than in all carrier aviation losses across the war. Men who stepped onto Fletcher-class and Benson-class destroyers in 1942 were boarding vessels among the deadliest in the fleet, despite a culture that subtly treated them as expendable. Understanding this danger requires grasping the destroyer's actual function. Officially, their duties spanned anti-submarine warfare, torpedo assaults on enemy ships, screening carriers and capital vessels, shore bombardments, mine operations, rescue missions, and high-speed transport of troops and supplies. In reality, Pacific commanders demanded all these missions simultaneously, often within the same 24-hour period. Crews of roughly 273 enlisted men and 15 officers rarely enjoyed more than 4 consecutive hours of sleep. Fatigue emerged as the first adversary, arriving long before the Japanese did. A Fletcher-class destroyer, the stalwart of the Pacific Fleet, stretched 376 feet from bow to stern, displacing about 2,500 tons fully loaded. That seemed substantial until compared with the behemoths they escorted. Iowa-class battleships displaced 57,000 tons, making a Fletcher alongside one resemble a border collie sprinting beside a freight train. The battleship's armor reached 12 to 13 inches at the waterline. The destroyer's hull was a mere 19 millimeters of high-tensile steel, less than 3/4 of an inch. Even a Japanese 25 millimeter anti-aircraft shell, identical to what Zero fighters carried, could pierce the superstructure without detonating. Yet the destroyer was expected to confront every challenge thrown its way with this thin protection. Severe sleep deprivation had measurable effects on cognition within 72 hours, and after 96 hours of extreme restriction, reaction times mirrored a blood alcohol level of 0.10%. Tasks demanding vigilance, like radar monitoring, fire control calculations, or sonar tracking, deteriorated sharply. The sailors operating some of the fleet's most complex electronics were physiologically compromised, not from negligence, but because the pace of operations exceeded human limits. And then came the Japanese aircraft. Destroyers in combat zones maintained round-the-clock 4-hour watch rotations. 4 hours on, 8 hours off. But those 8 hours were often interrupted by repeated general quarters alarms. During the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942, the crew of USS O'Bannon, DD-450, kept an informal record. Between August and November, general quarters were sounded 11 times per day on average. The men, theoretically entitled to 8 hours of rest, often received less than 90 uninterrupted minutes daily during peak operations. The waters around the Central Solomons had a deadly rhythm. Japanese planes from Rabaul arrived in predictable early afternoon schedules, their formations trackable by destroyer radar 45 minutes before weapons could engage. For 3/4 of an hour, sailors watched contacts close, damage control teams readied, 5-inch gun crews loaded practice rounds, boilers brought to full pressure, and deck crews stared skyward. Yet radar could not reveal the true menace. A Type 98 250-kilogram bomb, standard on Valdive bombers, fell 551 pounds from 12,000 feet, reaching terminal velocity before impact. A near miss was devastating. An explosion 30 feet off the port side could drive lethal shrapnel through the hull, while depth charges, set to safe rather than deep, could slam men into the deck with bone-breaking force. Medical care aboard a destroyer was primitive. The wardroom table doubled as a surgical station. Limited blood plasma and morphine were distributed to chief petty officers in small emergency kits. There were no blood banks, no specialized surgeons. A sailor suffering an abdominal fragment wound had survival odds akin to a Civil War casualty. Gunnery crews manning open mounts had no substantial armor. Navy regulations mandated only thin splinter shields around 20 millimeter mounts, virtually decorative against close bomb fragments. Typically, a 1-lieutenant junior grade, with roughly a year of general practice experience, was the ship's sole medical officer, supported by a pharmacist's mate and a tiny battle dressing station. Post-war studies found mortality for treated abdominal wounds at 78%, and burns covering over 30% of the body exceeded 90%. Below decks, the engineering spaces offered no relief. Fletcher boilers produced 600 pounds per square inch of steam. powering twin General Electric turbines to 60,000 combined shaft horsepower, yielding top speeds of 36.5 knots, faster than nearly any enemy floatplane. Yet this power came at a cost. Engineers worked in spaces often exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit, where a ruptured steam line could scald a man to death in under 4 seconds. These compartments were also where torpedoes struck most often. The Japanese Type 93 Long Lance torpedo carried a 1,080-pound warhead at 49 knots. Impact on a destroyer was less penetration than structural annihilation. A single strike could rip 40 to 80 feet of hull apart, devastate boilers, and leave men with virtually no chance to escape before compartments flooded. In 1942, the Navy's damage control procedures demanded that engineering crews fight flooding and attempt to restore power, evacuating only when water could no longer be contained. On a destroyer struck amidships by a Long Lance torpedo, the concept of uncontrollable measured in mere seconds, not minutes. At the Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30th, 1942, the USS Northampton, a heavy cruiser with far greater buoyancy than any destroyer, was struck by 2 Type 93 torpedoes within 20 minutes and sank in less than an hour. Destroyers, far lighter and more fragile, would have been claimed by the sea in mere moments under similar circumstances. That same night, USS Pensacola and USS New Orleans, both cruisers, had their engineering compartments flooded almost immediately after impact. If torpedoes had struck destroyers instead, the sinkings would have occurred in single-digit minutes. From this brutal reality, an unofficial destroyer culture emerged. Sailors who confronted statistical inevitability with relentless effort, speed, and a dark, gallows humor that outsiders often found bewildering, but insiders embraced as essential. Life aboard a Fletcher-class vessel extended beyond combat into relentless material hardships. A 30-day patrol consumed roughly 1,600 barrels of fuel for propulsion, plus additional diesel for auxiliary generators. Daily freshwater production from the ship's evaporators reached about 10,000 gallons, just enough for basic cooking and mechanical needs, insufficient for regular personal hygiene. Navy regulations allowed crews on prolonged missions to bathe in salt water, reserving fresh water for washing faces and hands. In the tropical Pacific, where ambient temperatures often exceeded 95 degrees and engineering spaces ran 25 degrees hotter, 300 men bathing in salt water without proper rinsing developed skin conditions that contemporary medical literature clinically described as tropical dermatitis and saltwater boils. Sailors, however, had simpler terms for their suffering. Food aboard destroyers ranged from logistical triumphs to bitter disappointments. The ship's commissary officer was allocated 30 days of standard Navy rations, roughly 3,400 calories per man per day, with fresh provisions lasting only the first 10 days. Afterward, eggs were powdered, meat canned, and bread baked aboard from flour that often grew weevils after 2 weeks in the tropical humidity. Bakers were ordered to sift, but not discard tainted flour because replacements were unavailable. During the Guadalcanal campaign, destroyers operating from Espiritu Santo or Numia occasionally endured shortened rations due to irregular convoy schedules. Men working machinery at high intensity in 120-degree compartments on just 2,200 calories per day lost weight at rates deemed medically dangerous in peacetime. The Navy's medical system was ill-equipped to handle these cumulative stresses. Dental care was largely limited to extractions performed by the pharmacist's mate with a manual forceps and a bottle of lidocaine, no fillings, no preventative care. After 6 months of combined saltwater bathing, erratic sleep, and absent dental treatment, crew surveys from the Solomon Islands indicated cavity rates approaching 80% among enlisted men. In extreme cases, sailors resorted to pulling their own teeth just to maintain the ability to stand watch. Despite these hardships, destroyers faced ever-increasing tactical demands. Night surface engagements in the Solomons diverged sharply from pre-war training. American doctrine in 1942 emphasized long-range daylight action, with destroyers playing supportive torpedo roles alongside capital ships. Meanwhile, Japanese strategy had evolved over a decade, using destroyers as the primary offensive instrument rather than mere screening forces. At the Battle of Cape Esperance on October 11, 1942, Rear Admiral Norman Scott led a force including 4 destroyers against a Japanese reinforcement convoy. The clash was chaotic, tragic, and revealing. Scott's destroyers suffered friendly fire from American cruisers. USS Duncan, DD-485, attempting to cross the Japanese formation, came under simultaneous fire from both Japanese and American ships and was sunk, resulting in the deaths of 11 officers and men. Although technically an American tactical victory, the battle underscored a crucial mismatch. American destroyer commanders were operating under doctrine ill-suited to night combat in confined waters. The tactical lessons learned from late 1942 into 1943 were steep and costly. At the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2, 1943, Rear Admiral Stanton Merrill's destroyer force demonstrated the tactical evolution. Destroyers led by Captain Arleigh Burke and Destroyer Squadron 23 executed textbook torpedo strikes against Japanese cruisers, disengaging at high speed before enemy guns could engage, and avoiding the friendly fire disasters that had plagued prior encounters. Burke's innovations included coordinated torpedo attacks using radar fire control data, a capability the Navy had possessed in theory since 1941, but had yet to employ successfully in night combat. One error, one rogue wave, one lapse in helm attention could still result in collisions, such as a 2,500-ton destroyer striking a fully loaded fleet oiler, ranging from bent bow plates to fires. The psychological toll of destroyer service revolved around one harsh fact. When a destroyer sank, its crew ended up in the water. Burke's flagship during this period, USS Charles Osborne, DD-570, along with other ships in his squadron, fought 5 separate night engagements, covered the Bougainville landings, screened carrier operations during Rabaul strikes, and conducted anti-submarine patrols over November and December, spending 28 days at sea out of every 30. Fueling at sea from fleet oilers required destroyers to maintain a position within 80 feet of the oiler's hull at 12 knots for up to 90 minutes in ocean swells. A controlled example of destroyer lethality occurred at the Battle of the Gulf on August 6, 1943. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger's force ambushed a Japanese transport group, sinking 3 destroyers, Hagakaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze, in under 4 minutes with coordinated torpedo strikes. Over 1,200 Japanese sailors entered the water. American destroyers, however, did not stop to rescue them. Remaining Japanese ships and the hazardous channel prevented extended operations. By 1944, carrier aviators had a more developed sea rescue apparatus, including life rafts, survival radios, and dedicated search aircraft. Submariners sometimes escaped via torpedo tubes or hatch trunks and could be recovered by Allied vessels. Soldiers had land as refuge. Destroyer men surviving a sinking-faced Pacific waters at night in combat zones, where conditions ranged from catastrophic to worse. Waters around 82 degrees Fahrenheit slowed hypothermia but offered no protection from sharks. Japanese rescue teams the following morning recovered fewer than 300 sailors. The rest drowned, succumbed to injuries, or were claimed by predators. In 1942, American doctrine offered virtually no rescue options for destroyer crews, and the surviving ships had orders to maintain formation and continue their mission. Halting to pull men from a sinking destroyer exposed the remaining ships to submarine attack and broke the cohesion of the formation. In practice, any sailor thrown into the water after a destroyer went down faced the brutal reality. Survival depended on being rescued within the first hour. Beyond 6 hours in tropical Pacific waters, dehydration, exposure, and shock often proved fatal, and climbing from the water offered no guarantee of life. USS Laffey, DD-459, stands as one of the most meticulously documented destroyer actions of the Guadalcanal campaign. On the night of November 12, 1942, Laffey engaged the Japanese battleship Hiei at such close range that her main battery could not depress enough to fire. Instead, Laffey launched a spread of torpedoes and pounded Hiei's bridge with 5-inch gunfire at what contemporary accounts described as point-blank distance. Japanese fire soon struck back, and the destroyer Teruzuki rammed Laffey, tearing open her stern. Laffey sank in under 2 minutes. Of her crew of roughly 247 men, only 59 survived. The brevity of rescue was decisive. Sailors not pulled from the water within 30 minutes were largely lost. That reality, not tonnage, sunk, or enemy destroyed, most accurately defines service aboard a destroyer. Sailors of 1942 and 1943 understood this mortality not abstractly, but concretely, by ship and date. They memorized events like USS Juneau being hit by a torpedo on November 13, 1942, sinking in 20 seconds. 20 seconds. Post-war analysis revealed that Juneau's forward fire room had stored depth charges improperly. The torpedo's impact detonated them, producing a secondary explosion that destroyed the ship almost instantly. Of 697 crew members, only 115 survived the initial explosion. Task Group 67. 4 did not pause. Orders mandated continuation of the engagement under strict radio silence to avoid alerting Japanese submarines. The men in the water waited 8 days for rescue. Ultimately, just 10 were recovered. Among them were none of the 5 Sullivan brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. All perished. 8 days in the ocean allowed survivors a harsh reckoning with the reality of destroyer service while the Navy pressed on, bound by a tactical doctrine that deemed stopping more dangerous than moving forward. This tragedy led to the Navy implementing the sole survivor policy in early 1943, theoretically preventing the last surviving sibling of a family from frontline assignment. Humane in intent, it did nothing for the 105 men who perished after 8 days adrift. By the Okinawa campaign in the spring of 1945, the destroyer's mission had evolved to a level that even the most hardened sailors of 1942 would have considered extraordinary. Radar picket stations encircled the invasion area, 16 in total, numbered RP-1 through RP-16, positioned up to 95 miles from the main fleet to provide early warning against kamikaze attacks from Kyushu. Destroyers and smaller vessels on picket duty were often alone, or nearly so, with no carrier air cover, minimal fighter direction, and a singular mission: absorb the first wave of attack to allow the main fleet time to respond. Between April 6th and June 22nd, 1945, Japanese forces launched 10 major Kikusui floating chrysanthemum operations, committing 1,465 kamikaze aircraft against the Okinawa invasion fleet. Radar picket destroyers were the primary target, not for their strategic value, but because their destruction would allow kamikazes to reach the main fleet with less warning and interception, increasing the probability of striking high-value ships. The result was unprecedented: systematic destruction of destroyer crews. USS Laffey, DD-724, a Sumner-class destroyer commissioned in 1944, was on Radar Picket Station 1 on April 16, 1945, when attacked by 22 Japanese aircraft in 80 minutes. Not over a day, not in wave-spanning hours, 22 aircraft in just 80 minutes. 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs struck her. The after 40mm mount was destroyed within minutes. 5-inch guns continued to fire manually despite power failures. Steering was lost. Fires erupted from bow to stern simultaneously. Commander Frederick Beckton, her captain, refused to abandon ship, reportedly telling his executive officer he would not leave while a single gun still fired. 4 crew members were killed instantly. By the attack's end, 31 were dead and 72 wounded out of roughly 336. Laffey did not sink. She barely reached Karamaretto under her own power, her fantail nearly washed away, and after section destroyed. The men lost on Laffey were not victims of a conventional battle between relatively equal forces. They were killed by an enemy weapon explicitly designed to use human bodies as delivery systems. For survivors, the kamikaze attacks of 1945 were psychologically distinct from prior combat. Not morally, but viscerally. Witnessing a human deliberately choosing death as a weapon, helpless to stop it, left an indelible imprint. By the Okinawa campaign's conclusion, the U.S. Navy had lost 36 ships sunk and 368 damaged, the highest losses in any American naval campaign. Most casualties occurred on destroyer radar picket stations. One such sailor was gunner's mate, 2nd Class James E. Roberts of USS Lyman K. Swenson, DD-729, assigned to Radar Picket Station 14 during the April 6th Kikusui attack. Lyman K. Swenson became the first ship destroyed by the Japanese Oka, a rocket-powered piloted bomb carrying a 2,645-pound warhead, diving at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. No destroyer fire control system could track a target maneuvering at that velocity. The Oka struck amidships on the port side, detonating with enough force to break the keel. Lyman K. Swenson sank in under 5 minutes. Roberts spent 4 hours in the water before rescue. At 22, he assisted 3 other men onto a floater net. One died before the rescue ship arrived. Roberts held the man's head above water for the final 40 minutes, unable to determine when he had perished. 74 survivors were recovered. The ship's complement had been 336. Roberts survived the war, returned to Haverhill, Massachusetts, and worked 35 years in a shoe factory. He attended alumni reunions, but never spoke in detail about the 4 hours adrift. Instead, he spoke of the destroyer itself, of the men he never knew personally, and of the aftermath visible from the water. A slick of fuel oil spreading across the blue Pacific, fragments of furniture, a life jacket. The rest vanished below. 2,500 tons of steel, engines, radar, torpedoes, ammunition, personal effects, and the men who had not escaped lay beneath. From the water, the wreck seemed small, its remains blending with the ocean, fading rapidly. Roberts passed away in 2009 at age 86, the last surviving member of Lyman K. Swenson's crew. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.